We're going to continue talking about mediation, but we will look at more practical aspects of mediation. So we will be looking a little bit at coursebook activities. One of you has asked if we could look at assessment of mediation activities. That's one of the things that I'm going to mention in this presentation, the second presentation today. Okay, yes, before we start, just one important thing. As you know, I got cut off somewhere towards the beginning of the first session. I hope that doesn't happen again, but if it does happen, I will be back within a minute or two. I don't know what happened. This is technology for you. Unfortunately, when we used technology, is fantastic, but it has certain drawbacks, and sometimes you just have to deal with the unexpected problems. Okay, so let's start our second session. So we're going to start off with a little translation exercise. Now, on the screen, you can see 5 sentences in English. I'm going to ask you to choose 2 of these sentences and translate them into your first language, into your native language. But you must not choose 2 sentences in a row. So you can, for example, choose sentence 1 and 3 or 1 and 5, but you must not choose 3 and 4, for example. Okay, so I'll give you a minute to do this, and when you're ready, can you write ready in the chat box so that I know that we can continue? Okay, so translate 2 sentences, but they must not be 2 sentences in a row. Okay, and you've got about a minute to do that, and when you're ready, can you write ready in the chat box? Okay, first person ready, Mariana, well done. Okay. Ready. Okay, we're getting more and more readies. Okay, let's give people another couple of seconds. Okay, more and more people are saying that they're ready. Well done. This is just a warm-up exercise. So now what I'd like you to do is translate these 2 sentences back into English. Okay, and again, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do it. And when you're ready, can you write ready in the chat box? Okay, so translate these 2 sentences back into English. And when you have finished doing the translation back into English, can you write ready in the chat box? Okay, I can see that people are starting to say ready, ready. Okay, well done. More and more people are ready. If you haven't finished translating both sentences, it's fine. This is just an example activity. So here are the English sentences for you to compare with your own translations. Okay, so have a look at the original sentences on the screen and compare your translation to the original sentence from which we started at the beginning of this activity. Now, I'm sure that you have done an excellent job and that you've done fantastic translations both into your language and then back into English. But this is what I would like to say about this activity is that this is an activity which works really well when you are working on vocabulary or on grammar. Okay, this is extremely intensive language practice and an exercise which works really well in terms of students remembering both vocabulary and grammar structures. Now, before we go on, I would like to draw your attention to the instructions which I gave you, particularly to this fragment. So first, I told you that you must not choose 2 sentences in a row. And then I actually repeated the same information, but in a different way, giving you an example. So in a way, I explained more clearly what I meant. And this is an example of mediation. And to be more specific, mediating a text, and to be even more specific, relaying a set of instructions. And this is what we do as teachers all the time. Translation, in other words, interlinguistic mediation, is something that you can also use with coursebook material. And what you can see on the screen is the word store in Focus Second Edition coursebook. And the word store accompanies a unit in the coursebook dealing with traveling. And the word store helps students consolidate vocabulary to do with different forms of travel and synonyms for the word trip. So let's have a look at one particular exercise which is of interest to us. And this is in fact not one exercise, but a sequence of exercises that are of interest to us. So first of all, there is a revision of vocabulary that we are focusing on. And students have definitions and they have to choose the right word. Then they do an exercise in which they have to use these words in sentences. But if you would like to provide further support for learning of this lexis, of this vocabulary, you can actually use a translation exercise. So students translate these sentences into their first language, and then without looking at the original sentences, they translate them back. By doing this exercise, by doing this activity, we actually achieve two aims. First of all, we reinforce the vocabulary we focus on, but at the same time, we increase the students' level of awareness of differences which exist in how we say the same things in different languages, and how sometimes there are conceptual differences, not only linguistic differences. And another example of how, sorry, you can use a translation exercise, also from Focus Second Edition, this time level 2. And this is a fragment of the student's book which focuses on writing. And from this whole sequence of activities, we are mostly interested in an exercise whose aim is to work on tentative language. In other words, how we can express things in a less negative and more polite way. And this is, of course, only a small part of a much larger topic of expressing politeness in different languages. So first, students learn about the use of tentative language, and then they rewrite strong-sounding sentences to make them more polite. And again, if you would like to provide more support in this area to your students, you can use a translation exercise where, after doing the exercise as it stands in the course book, students translate them into their first language and back again. And precisely as in the previous example, we actually kill two birds with one stone. We help students learn more effectively, but we also make them aware of the fact that politeness may be expressed in different ways in different languages. Now, I can tell you that English, as you know, has many more different ways of expressing tentativeness than my first language, Polish. So this kind of exercise is, in fact, a real opener for my students, but I'm quite sure that it's going to be a real eye-opener for your students as well. Now, in the first presentation today, I was talking about the bridges that mediation helps to build. In other words, how mediation helps to avoid or overcome misunderstandings, lack of understanding, or how it helps avoid potential misunderstandings. Just like I did with the important part of my instructions to you just a few minutes ago when we were starting to do the translation exercise. Now, as you know, there are millions of memes about teachers all over the internet. And I'm sure at least some of you have seen this one or this one. What do they have in common? Whether this is your kind sorry, what your kind of humor or not, what they show is that being a teacher is a really challenging profession for more reasons than I can list now. But then do I really need to list those reasons? I am speaking to teachers after all. So what does the CFR companion volume say about teachers' work? Let me quote. The interesting thing is that overcoming the reasons for potential misunderstanding is really what teaching, and particularly language teaching, is all about. For overcoming difficulties in language level, we reformulate, scaffold, simplify, and deconstruct. For difficult concepts, we explain, question, illustrate, exemplify, and elicit. To deal with different processing preferences, we reframe, adapt, mash up, supplement, and check. So, by the nature of things, a teacher is a multitasker. And here is one of my favorite memes about being a teacher. To make things even more difficult for English teachers, I don't know if you are aware of the fact that English has been found to be one of the strangest languages in the world. Now, what you see on the screen is the title of an article in an online journal, The Conversation. And the article reports on findings of a group of computational linguists who compared data about 239 languages in the World Atlas of Language Structures. And the aim of that comparison was to find out which languages have the most features different from other languages. And English actually came in 33rd place out of those 239 languages. And I'm sure this is something that you think from time to time as well, especially if you have to explain weird idioms and their meanings to students or strange workings of the English grammar. And this weird language is what we have to help students to learn. In other words, what we have to mediate for our students. The CFR companion volume gives a very useful suggestion with regard to when descriptors for mediation are most relevant. In other words, for a framework for activities is suggested in the companion volume. The mediation descriptors are particularly relevant for the classroom in connection with small group collaborative tasks, where tasks are organized in such a way that learners have to share different input, where they have to explain the information that they have, and they have to work together to achieve a goal. And this is something that we have actually seen in the previous session when I was showing you an exam task where students have to find solutions together. And these activities are actually even more relevant when all this is done in a CLIL context. Now, the idea of collaborating or collaboration is a very important one in the context of language learning and teaching, because language use is a collaborative experience where meanings are conveyed or negotiated. And it is in the context of collaboration that I would like to say a few words about a project which is run by Harvard Graduate School of Education. And the project is called Project Zero. And this is a project which is aimed at helping students of all subjects, and that obviously includes language teachers. And this is designed to help teachers help students make their learning visible. In other words, to give students an opportunity to develop skills which will help them understand what happens in the learning process. And through that, students will become better learners, not only at school, but also better lifelong learners. Now, one of the ways of making learning visible is by using so-called thinking routines. In other words, steps which we can use to scaffold and support student thinking. And one of the things that you will find on the website of Project Zero is a directory of resources which you can explore by topic. And I really encourage you to Google Project Zero and go to the website and really explore the resources which are there. There's an incredible wealth of resources. And yes, some of them are not relevant to language teachers, but a lot of them are very relevant to language teachers. This is something that I really, really highly recommend. But I would like to very briefly tell you about a very useful resource, which you will find under the heading of collaboration and group learning. And this is especially interesting for us when we are talking about the idea of linguistic mediation, because we know, again, something that we have already said before, that language use is a collaborative experience. And in this collaborative experience, language is a tool for communicating effectively and appropriately. Now, the specific resource that I would like to recommend to you is the Good Collaboration Toolkit. And the Good Collaboration Toolkit is a collection of materials and activities which are designed to help individuals and groups develop effective collaboration skills. And it is intended to be used by people who have either started collaboration already or who are about to start collaborating in groups or teams. And this is also addressed to students in secondary schools and beyond working on group projects. Now, based on a lot of research into collaboration in the field of education, Harvard researchers observed that good collaboration satisfies 8 elements. And these elements are that collaboration is excellently executed, it's leadership driven, engaging for participants, it's mission focused, ethically oriented, nurtured continuously, time well spent, and finally solution inspired. Now, the collaboration toolkit is actually organized around these 8 principles with 3 types of resources which support each of these 8 points. And the first type of resource is reflection questions. The second type of resource is 2 stories which relate to the element at hand. And one of these stories is a story where collaboration succeeds, and one is a story where collaboration does not succeed. And then the third type of resource is activities, which help those who collaborate on a project to further engage with one another and to reflect on the features and purposes of collaboration. So why don't we have a look at collaborative work in the context of coursebook? Now, the example that you can see on the screen at the moment comes from English Code Level 4, but this is obviously just an example. And as you can see in this fragment of the student's book, this is where students are doing a project, which is part of the review process. Now, what you can see on the screen now is part of the lesson plan for this project, which we saw in the previous slide. And the lesson plan you will actually find in the Pearson English portal, which obviously provides online materials and full support for the teacher. And just to make sure that we haven't missed this important point, let's make it a little bit bigger. And here we are, students complete a project and then present it. Now, you'll find that the lesson plan will provide you with a step-by-step information on what you should do with your students to make this activity a success. Now, we're not going to go over the whole lesson plan because this is what you are all very familiar with. And also, as you can see, the lesson plan contains a lot of information, so much so, in fact, that I had to minimize it and cut it into 3 pieces to fit onto my PowerPoint slide. But what I want to do is to point out how linguistic mediation comes into teaching and learning when we are dealing with project work in the classroom. So as a quick reminder, going back to my first session, you will remember this division of mediation skills or classification of mediation skills into mediation activities and mediation strategies and how each of them is subdivided. And of course, this is just a reminder, something to bear in mind when we start looking at important details in this comprehensive lesson plan in Pearson English Portal. And what I'd like to do is actually what we can look at what we can see in the language which is used in the lesson plan. Now, the language used in this lesson plan has an important significance in the context of linguistic mediation. So here is what you will see a lot of in the lesson plan provided for the teacher. Discuss with a partner, have students work with a partner, ask and answer with the partner. Students work in pairs or small groups, or students discuss. And all this refers to working in small groups or pairs, collaborating on a given task. So which mediation skill is actually involved? Well, I think we will all agree that this is mediating concepts. And in this category, we have collaborating in a group and leading group work. And I'm sure your experience, as much as it is mine, is that when students work together, there is usually one person who assumes the role of the leader. Now, we can also find very clear examples of mediating a text. So, note-taking or relaying specific information, but also expressing a personal response to creative texts. And I'm really sorry, I have to stop for a second and I need to take a drink of water. So I'm just going to mute myself for 3 seconds, okay? Okay, I'm back, and let's hope that I won't be feeling the need to cough anytime soon again. Okay, so again, coming back to what I was talking about, mediating a text, note-taking, relaying specific information, but also expressing a personal response to creative texts. And finally, in that lesson plan, students play a game in 2 teams. And yes, I am aware that you can't see the details. That's not the point of what we're talking about. In this game, in order to score, teams need to cooperate on completing tasks. So there's only one player who actually does the task, but the team support him or her in carrying out the task, and they help the player with the decisions that have to be made regarding the task. Now let's have a look at a different scenario, and this time we will actually look at listening activities. Now what you can see on the screen is a listening task which has been designed to give students practice in identifying key details in a narrative. And this is where the actual listening is taking place. So let's have a look at what happens when we do a listening activity in general. So generally, we start off with a lead-in and pre-teaching key vocabulary, which is key, of course, for comprehension. And when we're talking about lead-in, then it's, for example, chatting about the topic by asking students questions, relating this to students' personal experience where it is relevant, showing pictures, headlines to catch their interest, etc., etc. Then, of course, we set a comprehension task, and it could be a number of different comprehension tasks. Could be questions, gap fills, like in the exercise which I showed you and which you can actually see on the left-hand side of the screen. Then, of course, we need to play the listening. And then, very importantly, we let students compare answers in pairs or in groups before playing the listening again if that's necessary. Again, letting students compare answers in pairs or groups, and then checking answers in plenary. And then, of course, if necessary, we can replay relevant fragments if there were some problems across the whole group, for example, with a certain fragment. You can also accompany this by reading the script at the same time, which will actually help students see what it was that they missed in the listening activity. Now, there are two stages which I would actually like to spend a little bit more time talking about. And it's these moments when, before checking the answers with the whole group, so in plenary mode, we allow students to check their answers in pairs or groups. Why did I say it's really important? Well, there are two main reasons. The first one, I'm sure that you have noticed something like this. So when students are completing a task, they kind of surreptitiously check with a neighbor anyway. And it gives the students a lot more confidence in their ability if they can see that the same answer was given by another student. And so they will be much more likely to speak out in plenary. I think you can probably guess the second reason. And since today is the day when we're discussing mediation in all possible ways, of course, the reason is linguistic mediation. Imagine a situation where the two students comparing answers have two different answers. What they need to do is to explain the answers to each other. And so effectively, they are mediating a text. And in fact, you will find very explicit instructions in the course book to get students to discuss answers to a task in pairs or groups. In other words, to mediate, to construct meaning together, collaboratively. Let's have a look at another mediation activity. And this time it's an activity which comes from High Note, level 2. And what you can see is the section which is called Watch and Reflect, which focuses around videos. And in this Watch and Reflect, this particular exercise is of interest for us. And this is because it's an exercise where students practice summarizing skills. And so to be much more specific, we're actually looking at mediating a text. And here in mediating a text, we have the following subcategories: relaying specific information, explaining data, processing text, translating, which is something that we have done together, note-taking, expressing a personal response, and analysis and criticism of creating texts. And the one which includes summarizing is processing text. And so if we want to be even more specific about which subskills it is, then for level B1, one of the descriptors for processing text would be like this. At level B1, a student can summarize the main points or events in TV programs or video clips, provided that they can view them several times. And of course, that provision, provided that she or he can view them several times, that's going to be lessened as we go up in terms of level. Now, here, what you can see is an example from a section focusing on the reading skill. And what we were interested in is this particular exercise. So just to make sure that you can all see it, I've made it a little bit bigger. And this is also a linguistic mediation exercise, also in the category of mediating a text. Now, the CEFR companion volume has figured quite prominently in the presentation today, but I would like us to look at an important quote from the book, which really very nicely sums up what we have just been looking at in terms of classroom materials and activities. And the quote is this: the focus is on the role of language in processes like creating the space and conditions for communicating and or learning, collaborating to construct new meaning, encouraging others to construct or understand new meaning, and passing on new information in an appropriate form. Now, I would like us to go back to the Project Zero for just one moment and to the idea of making learning visible. In other words, creating conditions in which students are able to see or to understand what happens in the learning process with the view of making them better, more successful, more effective learners. So let's examine an interesting concept which is connected with the idea of visible learning, and that is teaching focused on conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding basically means that students can not only understand facts, but they also understand how these facts are connected. But also, on top of that, they gain the ability to transfer knowledge and skills gained to completely new situations which they haven't come across before. Now, when we talk about conceptual understanding or teaching focused on conceptual understanding, this is an example that I have taken from Facebook, and I'm sure that you have seen this either on Facebook or on Instagram. It's been something that's been making the rounds on social media for quite a while, but this is an interesting example. So when we talk about data, although this is precisely about data, it's really also about a set of images about linguistic mediation, and you will see why and how in just a moment. So we have a whole lot of data. Now, in order to make sense of the data, we need to do something with it because this pile is not really meaningful beyond the fact that there is a lot of it. And because there is a lot of it, it can be really daunting. So what can we do to make it meaningful? Well, we need to sort the data. Okay, so we sort the data. Here, the example is we sort it according to color. We can also arrange the data. We can present it visually. And finally, and most importantly, we can explain the data by using it in a story. Now, language learning and communication require sorting through a lot of data. And sometimes you need help with understanding how this data is connected and how to make sense of it. And this is exactly where linguistic mediation comes in. So let's think about an example of grammar. And data in this case will be a lot of different sentences in different tenses. So what can we do with this data, with those sentences in different tenses? We can sort them according to tense. We can also arrange them into present, past, and future tenses, which helps understanding one step further. We can also arrange the sentences in a table. So the left-hand column is the time, and the upper row is the aspect, simple, continuous, and perfect. And if you combine the time from the left-hand column and the aspect from the first row, you actually come up with grammatical tenses: present simple, past simple, future simple, present continuous, present perfect, etc., etc. And of course, this is presenting the data visually to students. And finally, we can, of course, use sentences in a story which shows and explains through that tense usage. And a perfect example is, of course, narrative tenses in English. But the example that I'm going to show you now, which comes from the Focus course book, is a very good example of clarifying the meaning of different grammar forms in a story. But here we're actually dealing with future forms in English. And so whenever in your teaching you engage students in pair work, you allow them to practice mediation skills. And this is what we do day in, day out. And so these two categories, mediating concepts and communication, also encompass projects, which we have spent a little bit of time looking at, and also problem-solving activities. So remember, whenever you do pair work or group work tasks with your students, This is linguistic mediation. Whenever you engage students in projects or in problem-solving activities, these are also linguistic mediation activities, and they fall under the category of mediating concepts and communication. But equally, whenever in the course book you have these types of tasks, open reading and listening comprehension tasks, translation and transformation tasks. And again, translation task is something that we have looked at the very beginning of our second session. Transformation tasks, something that you're very familiar with, especially when we are talking about preparing students for either external exams or national exams at the end of the primary education or secondary education. Gapped summaries, rewriting text in different registers. So you've got a formal text and students need to change it to informal register, or the other way around. They have an informal email and they have to change it to a formal email. Or picture description, speculating about the content of the picture, drawing conclusions. These are all tasks which fall under the category of mediating a text. And so we have reached something that some of you have been asking about, and that's assessing mediation skills. And for some reason, and I don't quite know why, my presentation is again having a life of its own, and it's moving forward without my help. So let's hope that it's going to yeah, it is again moving without my help, and I'm not quite sure why. So let's try again. Okay, so assessing mediation skills. This is, of course, assessing mediation skills and providing feedback on mediation skills is a very important area that quite a lot of you, as I understand, have to do. And so here, it's where the companion volume is quite helpful. So what do you need to do? Well, first of all, go to the page where you can find the descriptors for mediation skills. And first of all, you will see a table with overall mediation descriptors without going into specific details of types of mediation and specific activities. But I would really recommend that you actually have a look at these descriptors, because they will give you a much better idea of what mediation actually includes and what it is that you should expect from your students in terms of mediation activities. And so just to give you, again, my presentation is has a life of its own. So let's try again. Okay, so just to give you an example, here are descriptors for level B1. And the key points in these descriptors are those: showing interest and empathy, formulating and responding to suggestions, checking agreement, suggesting alternatives, conveying main points in a long text, inviting contributions, and conveying information from text. Now, so you've got two different skills, one which include the word conveying. One is conveying main points, and then the other one is conveying information from text. So this gives you an idea of what skills you should expect from students and what it is that they will need to work on. But of course, in particular types of tasks, you will need to be a little bit more specific. And again, I don't know what's happening with my computer, but it has a life of its own. Okay, so again, going back, relaying specific information in speech, which is a specific type of task and a specific type of skill. And this is, of course, a sub-skill of mediating a text. And so we will look again at the same level, and that's B1 level. And at this level, we've got 3 can-do statements. So students can relay the content of public announcements and messages spoken in clear standard language at normal speed. They can relay the contents of detailed instructions or directions, provided that these are clearly articulated. Again, this is level B1, so there are certain provisions in terms of the difficulty of language. And the third can do is can relay specific information given in straightforward informational text, such as leaflets, brochures, letters, emails, etc. So these can do statements form a standard that your B1 students will be reaching for. And this means that when assessing this skill, you need to look at how far they are from this standard and what kind of support you as the teacher can give them to make it easier for them to reach that particular standard. So just to give you an example, in this particular context, you could say you can relay information from a brochure well. What you need to work on now is making it a little less chaotic so that it's easier to understand. Okay, so you know, with the principles of giving feedback in mind, we tell the student what they can do now and what it is that they need to work on. Now, effective communication is obviously what we want to teach our students. And you know, gone are the days when we believed that this involved teaching them tenses and lists of words. Effective communication is so much more than building bricks of language systems. It's the ability to offer empathy, open-mindedness, helpful feedback based on what you hear, and also friendliness, confidence, and quality non-verbal communication leading to developing good relationships. That's what language is all about. And so what are the benefits of teaching effective communication rather than tenses and words? And effective communication, of course, in this context includes teaching mediation skills. So what are the benefits of that? Well, first of all, it's building trust. It's also preventing or helping to resolve problems in an easier way. It helps to create better relationships, something that we have already mentioned. It also promotes team building. So these are all the benefits of teaching effective communication rather than teaching tenses and words. And with that, thank you very much for listening to what I had to say about the topic of mediation. And again, a very quick look at the sources that I have used for the graphics in my presentation. And what I would like to do now is I would like to check the Q&A box and see if there's anything that you would like me to say or to answer. Yelena is asking, what are the typical mistakes that we might make in the process of mediation? I think it's a very general question, and it's difficult to answer it in an equally general way because mediation comprises so many sub-skills. So I think it depends on what kind of sub-skill you're talking about, and also whether you're talking about mediating concepts or mediating strategies. But generally speaking, you know, like with any communication and communication skill, we can make mistakes in mediation if we don't understand what it is that we're mediating. So in other words, you know, going back to what I was talking about previously, we sometimes think that communication is happening when it's not happening. You know, we have an illusion of communication. And in that case, mediating certain concepts or mediating certain ideas is not going to be correct. But generally speaking, mediation is something that actually helps us to make communication much more accurate, because that's the negotiation of meaning. So when, for example, somebody says something and you don't quite understand it, or you're not sure if you understand it, and you check with that person, that's you know, what you're doing is actually mediation. So mediation is not a skill which creates the potential for mistakes. It's a skill which creates the potential for resolving problems and correcting mistakes in communication. Thank you very much for all these very positive comments. It's been a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about mediation. If you have any other questions that you would like me to answer about mediation, please type them into the Q&A box. If not, thank you very much once again for listening to what I had to say about mediation. Apologies for a technical problem in the first session. Luckily, it was resolved very quickly. We didn't have, I hope, any technical issues in the second session, which I'm very happy about. Thank you very much. Somebody said, thank you, it doesn't seem so scary anymore. Lucia, thank you so much for saying that. Mediation is really not scary at all. It's something that we do all the time, every day. We do it across languages, we do it within languages. And it's just, I think it's a concept which has become a little scary for teachers because we never called it mediation. So, for example, when you think about translation work, you know, we never called it mediation, we just called it translation. Or summarizing, we never called it mediating a text, we just called it summarizing. So, as I said, you know, yes, it may sound a bit or look a bit scary, but when you think about the fact that this is something that we've been doing all along, and this is something that we've been teaching our students all along, it actually becomes a lot less scary. Okay, let me just check if there's anything else in the Q&A. In terms of the copies of the presentation, this is something that you'll need to discuss with your regional Pearson representative. Again, thank you very much for all your positive comments. Thank you for your participation in the session. I do hope that I have managed to make linguistic mediation a little bit less scary for all of you. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity of talking to you about this really important topic. Thank you.